Hello everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. My name is Ryan, I'm one of the educators here, and today we are going to be talking about kind of a follow-up topic to one of the demos that James did a couple days ago, where he talked about kind of the closest living relatives of humans. So he was using a bunch of these skulls, and he got our skeleton up to kind of chat about it a little bit too, and kind of the idea was to get people kind of thinking about how closely related we are to certain other things in our environment. I think there's a lot of times of a sort of temptation to think of humans as being something that is really separate, really distinct from the world around us, but we are made by the world around us, and we affect the world around us. We're as much a part of our natural ecosystem here on Earth as anything else living, and so I think that's something that is important to be thinking about and important to recognize. But one of the other things that's kind of unique about humans is how much we love sorting and categorizing things, and that doesn't stop at we have a change drawer in our till at the Science Center where we sort all the different coins. We love sorting and categorizing just in general, and that includes doing that sort of stuff with things like animals, including humans and our closest relatives. And so, like I said, that's kind of what James was talking about the other day, but I have most of those skulls out in front of me here again today because I wanted to talk about sort of how scientists decide what we call a human and what we decide isn't a human. Because it's kind of an interesting thing that actually has a lot of really weird history behind it, a lot of interesting history that really is very tumultuous. It's not as static of a thing as maybe we might think it is, kind of deciding what's human and what's not. And so I think we'll start out by kind of talking about like way back in history, kind of, well, we'll start in the 1800s, let's say. Starting kind of in, this is probably 1700s actually. This is like Carl Linnaeus stuff initially. And so Linnaeus is this scientist who does a lot of the categorizing, so every time you hear like scientific names for stuff, that's using a naming system that this guy named Linnaeus came up with. And so this is where you get like your genus and your species and your phylum and all that stuff. And he, within that system and the people around him, came up with sort of ways to categorize different types of humans too, and this eventually becomes not great because it turns into a lot of like really harmful race science later. But what's interesting about that particular categorizing that he was doing is he had a category of human that was called the Monsteroids. And the Monsteroids were a group of humans that were sort of mysterious and were like not well understood by science because it's at a period of time when a lot of the world hadn't been explored, but you would hear stories about these different types of people that like lived in the wilderness that were like kind of people but kind of not type of thing. And so Linnaeus and like I said his contemporaries built into their kind of race science categories this group called the Monsteroids. And it's generally assumed today that sort of the basis for the Monsteroids, the things that like were the Monsteroid humans, were things like the other great apes. And particularly orangutans is kind of assumed to be like what was the primary inspiration for the Monsteroid humans. Because a lot of the stories they were basing them off of were from Southeast Asia where orangutans live. And so you can see all the way going back to, like I said, this is like the 1700s, there's already question marks about what's a human, where it's like, yeah, this thing's sort of human, it's kind of not, and this is modern science, but it's kind of the very start of modern science as we think of it, where we have, like I said, already question marks about what makes a thing a human versus what makes a thing not a human. And then we can cut to kind of going all the way up into, call it like the 1940s, 1950s or so. I should have looked up more dates before I commented here, but mid-1900s. And excavations for pre-human ancestor remains in Africa are well underway. And they're finding all these sort of pre-human things. We have all of our various Australopithecines that are discovered. relatively quickly there, back in like the 30s and 40s. They're already finding some of these Australopithecines, and the Australopithecines are kind of considered to be like immediate pre-human ancestors. So this skull here is an Australopithecus africanus. It's a cast, it's not real, but Australopithecus africanus. But eventually they stumble upon this skull that is a little different. It's a little interesting. And so the question that's been coming with all these Australopithecus skulls is when do we quit calling them Australopithecus and when do we start calling them Homo sapiens? Like where do we draw the line? Where do we decide that this is a human versus not a human? And this is a question that has existed for as long as like evolutionary biology has existed, is where do you draw the lines between species? But excuse me. They start finding in a lot of the same soil layers and a lot of similar locations as these Australopithecus africanus remains. They start finding a little bit different population, and what's more important to this is that they don't just find bones, they don't just find fossils. What they find is tools. And so these remains belong to a species that we now call Homo habilis. And basically, Homo habilis gets put into genus Homo based on the fact that it uses tools. And so Homo is the genus that humans belong to. So like humans are Homo sapiens. What we're talking about is Homo habilis here. And Homo habilis exists about 2 million years ago. It's considered to be, at the time, and by most like contemporary people even too, to be like the first thing to be in genus Homo. And what Homo means is same. So it's the genus that we gave ourselves to say this is for us and all the things that are the same as us. And so it's kind of a big deal to get put into genus Homo because it is saying, yes, you're like us, you belong with us, you are us. And so when the question comes up of like, what do we consider human? This genus Homo designation is something that is very important to a lot of people, which has raised questions about how we put things in it. Like I said, Homo habilis is one that exists at the same time as Australopithecus africanus, is morphologically really not any different than Australopithecus. Excuse me. Morphologically, like as far as how the skulls look, is really not all that different from Australopithecus africanus. The big thing that made people say, yeah, this is different and this is human, is the fact that, like I said, it had tools with it. They use stone tools. This is the tool tradition is called the Oldowan tool tradition. It's mostly defined by hand axes, this kind of thing. It's just a sharp rock, basically, that you're hitting stuff with. But they're modifying things from their environment to make tools, and that's what, at the time, like I said, this is back in, I think, the 50s, where they decided, like, yes, if you are a hominid primate and you are using tools, then you are human. Problem is, as we start getting more information, as time goes on, we start seeing more and more other things that are using tools, including things like Australopithecus africanus also being a tool user. The other person who really did a lot for kind of blowing up that whole what is human and defining humanity based on using tools is Jane Goodall. And so Jane Goodall is a scientist you probably heard of, and that's her big contribution. That's why you've heard of her, is because she was the first person to really observe chimpanzees using complex tool usage. And the fact that chimpanzees were using tools like that really shook up the scientific world as far as how we consider things to be human. So there's like genuinely a movement out there of scientists that advocate now for chimpanzees to quit being pan-troglodytes, is their current scientific name, and to rename them Homo troglodytes, call them part of genus Homo. And kind of the way that the pushback argument on that, like why it hasn't happened, is they basically added another qualification for being human, where they said you have to, one, be doing complex tool usage, but also now you have to be a full-time bipedal creature. You have to you have to walk on 2 feet all the time, which chimpanzees don't do. They mostly knuckle walk. So that's been the way that they've excluded chimpanzees from genus Homo for the last 40 years or so at this point. But it does bring back questions of our friend Africanus here. Because like I said, morphologically, it's really not any different than Homo habilis. Like, it skull-wise looks about the same, body anatomy looks about the same. Africanus is a full-time bipedal walker. It walks on 2 feet all the time, and it's using tools, but we still call it Australopithecus africanus rather than Homo africanus. And so the question for that is well, why? Like, it seems to meet all the qualifications, and realistic excuse me, guys. Realistically, the answer is just we haven't gotten around to it. Sorry. We haven't gotten around to it. And because it's really hard to change a category once it's already been set. It's really hard to change a name once it's already been set. And so going back and retroactively changing a scientific name is really a big deal. It doesn't happen very often. A good example of one where this did happen, though, is with this other one I've got out right here. So this one on the side here, you'll see it says Australopithecus boisei on it. And this is another species that existed maybe 2.5 million years ago or so. Little bit older than what we generally think of Africanus and habilis being. But in the modern times, in modern classifications, you don't really see this as Australopithecus boisei anymore. I need a drink of water. Normally I have a glass of water with me, but I forgot it today. You hear this called a Paranthropus boisei. And basically the thing that made them separate this out into its own separate thing is that it was decided that the Australopithecines are the ones that are direct human ancestors, and the Paranthropines are basically the ones that aren't. It's a separate lineage that breaks off and then eventually dies out, rather than becoming an actual direct human ancestor. But again, this is a species that was an upright walker, is a species that I'm actually not 100% sure off the top of my head if these guys were tool users or not. But again, it's a species that, and there's basically an argument to be made that any of the Australopithecines or Paranthropines could be lumped into genus Homo based on sort of the official designation of genus Homo, which really calls into question like the validity of that of that definition. And we've just got a couple more here. And so these are 3 skulls that are all currently a part of genus Homo. So this one I have here is Homo sapiens sapiens. This is a anatomically modern human. This is a Cro-Magnon. So this is kind of in the genus Homo, this is the thing that you have to be the same as or similar enough to kind of get put in there. Because there is a certain argument to be made that, you know, when you say human, you're referring specifically to Homo sapiens, and that, you know, genus Homo isn't enough to say you're human. You actually have to be a Homo sapiens. So that calls into question now, okay, well, how do we differentiate between Homo sapiens versus Homo erectus versus Homo neanderthalis? And Neanderthals, which is what this one is, represent a good instance of, again, things kind of changing around a little bit, because for a long time, this was, like I just called it here a second ago, Homo neanderthalis is what this was called. So was in genus Homo, but considered a separate species to humans. So Homo neanderthalis versus Homo sapiens. But evidence now suggests that Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens were able to interbreed with each other relatively freely and produce viable young. Which by the definition that most people use as species would mean that they are actually not different species, but in fact the same species. And so now, and it actually does have this on this one, rather than being Homo neanderthalis, you now have them listed as Homo sapiens neanderthalis, and instead of just being Homo sapiens, you see it as Homo sapiens sapiens. And what you have, when you have 3 words like that, what that means is it has what we call a subspecies. And so, like, for example, animal that we see a lot of that has a lot of different subspecies is like dogs have a lot of different subspecies. So you'll have Canis lupus versus Canis lupus familiaris, for example. Canis lupus is a wolf, and there's a whole bunch of different wolves, but then Canis lupus familiaris is domestic dogs. So wolves and dogs can interbreed with each other, and so using the definition that they tend to use, it makes them the same species. And so then you, rather than saying separate species, you separate them into subspecies. So we can say, yeah, these are different, but not in a way that we can really like actually define, is kind of what it means when there's a subspecies. And we'll just talk briefly on this one too, just because it's kind of an interesting one. And so this is a Sinanthropithecus is what this is initially called. These days, you'll hear it more referred to as just a subspecies of Homo erectus. Homo erectus Sinanthropus or something like that is what it's called. And so this is a pre-human hominid primate that is from China. That's what the Sino part of it is, China. That was found in China. Like I said, these days you generally see this just referred to as a subspecies of Homo erectus rather than its own species. And this one's really interesting because there's actually two different genus Homo things that are existing at about the same time when this thing exists. So you have your Homo erectuses that are this species, the first genus Homo thing that is like going out and leaving Africa basically is Homo erectus. And so you see Homo erectus existing all throughout like southern Asia. So there's Homo erectus stuff all the way over in, you know, like Vietnam, Cambodia area and Southeast Asia there. They don't really go very far north. They kind of just leave Africa and follow the southern border of Asia all the way across to the ocean over there. But there's also a population that stay behind in Africa. And these are initially the same population. And so they separate off. And like I said, the ones that leave Africa, basically we call Homo erectus. And the ones that stay in Africa, we call Homo ergaster. And so there's really no, beyond just like the location of them and like how far they move, there's not really any difference between these two individuals. There's not like a real morphological, a real genetic basis for separating Homo erectus and Homo ergaster. It's just where they're from. And what's more important than that even is Homo ergasters are the ones that are the direct ancestors to us, because we're humans, so we always have to think of things in terms of how they relate to humans. And the Homo erectuses are the ones that go off and eventually die off and are lost to the sands of time for the most part. And so it's an interesting thing is science has changed what the definition of human is repeatedly as more information comes. Because like I said, we love to categorize things. And, you know, and if you're doing this as like good science, like if you're doing this science by the textbook, what you end up with is a definition of human that is kind of constantly expanding to include the things that meet the initial category. So you're like, okay, it uses tools and it stands upright, and it's a hominid primate. That's a human. That belongs in genus Homo. But because we are human, and because we hold that definition of human very dear, rather than doing it that way, a lot of the times what happens is we, like I said, go the opposite way, where we decide what is human and then make up the rules to exclude rather than using the rules to decide what gets included. We change the definition to exclude the things we want to exclude rather than using a real definition, basically. But I think that's important to understand, is that even within science, like there's a tendency to want to deify it, to kind of think of science as this thing that is objective and like, you know, self-correcting, all these things. But ultimately, science is just a process. Science is a process by which you come to a conclusion. Science can provide you with data, it can provide you with information, but at the end of the day, it still has to be humans that interpret that information. And so human error is always a problem along the whole way. And like I said, even if you do a really great experiment as flawless as you can make it. At the end of the day, it still has to be a human that interprets the data that you get. And like I said, you can end up with things that don't really make a whole lot of sense just because, like I said, of human interpretation, and also, like I said, sometimes science just moves kind of slow. Like I said, there's no reason as far as science is concerned for this to be an Australopithecus and not a genus Homo. There's really no reason for Homo erectus and Homo ergaster to be separate species. There's nothing functional that separates Homo neanderthalis from Homo sapiens as far as any of the definitions of species that really get used in science. So, like I said, hopefully that's interesting to you guys. Hopefully it gets you thinking about this type of stuff. And for the most part, like I said, science is good. I work at a science museum. I'm obviously very pro-science here. But I think it's important to remember that there is interpretation that comes with science. Science doesn't give you conclusions. Humans come up with conclusions based on science. And so, like I said, I think we'll call that a wrap for today. Talk a little bit about some of our little more philosophical end of things from, like I said, following up on James's talk from the other day. Like I said, hopefully you guys found that interesting. Tomorrow, what is tomorrow? Saturday? So it's probably going to be me on the show tomorrow, but I don't know what that show is going to be just yet. So we will see you then, and hopefully you guys have a great time. Hours. Headwaters Science Center is open right now. We're open from 9:30 to 5 Monday through Saturday, and then 1 to 5 on Sundays. So come in after lunch on Sundays. And if you come by at 3:30, oftentimes we'll be doing one of these shows. Sometimes they're kind of little hidden behind the scenes-y things that you're not going to see. But a lot of times we'll just be out on the main exhibit floor doing a demo or doing a little talk like this, and people are welcome to come and sit and watch. And like I said, a lot of times we'll even get them involved if they're here. So if you think that sounds interesting, like I said, swing by at 3:30, and we just might be doing a show that you can watch and maybe even participate in. But otherwise, I'm going to sign off here. Thank you guys, and we will see you tomorrow.